My name is James Bernett, and the year I stopped forgiving people, the city turned itself green for St. Patrick's Day, as if color alone could absolve anything. Every bar along the river had shamrocks in the windows. Every hotel lobby smelled of polish, lilies, and expensive whiskey. Even the cold seemed ceremonial. It came off the water in slow, sharp breaths and moved through the streets like a priest who had heard too much and chosen silence. I remember thinking that morning that public joy is often just private guilt wearing brighter clothes. By then, I had become good at recognizing disguises. I was 48, old enough to know that betrayal never begins where you think it does. It does not begin in a hotel room or in a falsified signature, or in the moment a trusted voice says your name with its warmth already gone. It begins earlier, in a smaller place, usually in some kindness you mistake for permanence. That was my error, not trust. Trust is too simple a word. My error was believing that loyalty, once proven, remained alive without maintenance. I believed that if people had once loved me honestly, they would continue to act as though that fact mattered. I was wrong in several directions at once. The business carried my family name because I had dragged that name out of one form of shame and into another more elegant one. Burnett Holdings sounded larger than it was. In truth, we owned 3 event properties, a hospitality supply company, and a narrow but lucrative consulting arm that handled private acquisitions for people who preferred discretion to publicity. Hotels, clubs, old restaurants, boutique properties with debt hidden under charm. We did not sell pleasure. We sold continuity. We were the men people called when they wanted a place to keep its legend but lose its liabilities. I had built most of it after my father died, and my elder cousins proved more sentimental than disciplined. Family businesses always produce 2 species of heir, the ones who inherit the burden and the ones who inherit the story. I got the burden. My cousin Michael got the story. Michael Burnett was 6 years younger than me, handsome in the vague way that middle-aged men remain handsome if they have never been forced to think too much about consequence. He had a patient smile, expensive haircuts, and the social instinct of a man who could smell loneliness on other people before they could smell danger on him. Women found him attentive. Men found him easy. Investors found him modern, which is often just another word for unencumbered by conscience. I found him useful for many years. That is as close to love as some families ever come. When our father was alive, he used to say Michael had the lighter step, and I had the stronger back. He thought he was complimenting us both. In practice, it meant that when creditors needed calming, I sat across from them until the numbers stopped trembling. When donors needed courting, Michael bought them the second bottle and remembered their children's schools. That division of labor lasted long enough to feel natural, long enough to become dangerous. We were not enemies, not then. Enemies are easier to manage than brothers who still call after midnight to ask whether you remember the smell of your mother's kitchen in February. My mother died in March, too. That detail matters to me because grief arranges itself around anniversaries with a kind of vindictive intelligence. She died on the 14th, 3 days before St. Patrick's Day, when I was 19 and Michael 13. A stroke at breakfast. One hand still wrapped around her teacup when she slid sideways in the chair. Afterward, the house felt permanently interrupted. Our father drank more carefully, which was worse than drinking openly. Michael began learning how to charm away attention. I began learning how to absorb it. Even then, before I had the language for it, I understood that in some homes love is not the same as safety. In some homes, love is simply the reason people expect more from your suffering. I married Claire Donnelly at 31 because she looked at me as if effort itself were a virtue. She worked in development for a museum when we met, and she had that rare quality of being polished without seeming rehearsed. Around her, people confessed ambitions they had disguised even from themselves. She listened with her whole face. She never rushed to fill silences. She made patience feel like a form of intelligence. For 12 years she was my wife, and for most of those years I would have told any man who asked that she was the cleanest part of my life. We had no children. That had been grief first, then disappointment, then an agreement we never named aloud. By the end of it, the silence in the house had become so orderly it almost looked chosen. I should say plainly that Claire did love me once. I believe that. It makes the rest of the story less convenient and more true. People prefer betrayal to come from counterfeit affection because it preserves their vanity. Mine did not. Claire loved me in the years when I still knew how to come home before midnight, when I still thought success meant increasing the size of the rooms in which other men could lie to me. She loved me before the business became not only my work, but my syntax. Later, when I spoke about contracts with more feeling than I spoke about dinner, she grew quieter. I noticed her quietness and misread it as maturity. Men like me often mistake resignation for peace. The first sign was not Claire. It was the Palmer House project. Not the hotel itself, but a private acquisition vehicle we had structured around an old lakeside property outside the city. A former convent turned retreat venue that 3 investors wanted repositioned as a luxury member's estate. The numbers were delicate, the title history messy, and the political sensitivities worse than either. It should have stayed with me. Instead, I let Michael lead the negotiations because he was good with families and local committees, and because I was managing 2 refinancings at once. That is the practical version. The emotional version is less flattering. I was tired, and tired men delegate not only tasks but vigilance. At the same time, Claire began helping with the charitable side of the St. Patrick's Day Gala we hosted each year at our flagship property, the Ashdown Club. The gala was half fundraiser, half display of controlled vanity. Judges, council members, trustees, union men, restaurateurs, clergy with discreet appetites, and the sort of donors who preferred their names engraved on old things. Claire had the temperament for such rooms. She knew how to speak warmly to boring people without encouraging them. She knew how to redirect a drunk without humiliating him. She knew how to make a widow feel seen and a politician feel managed. Michael praised her constantly for it. So did I. That is another thing worth saying plainly. At the beginning, their closeness looked like competence. If I had been a jealous man, perhaps I would have seen it sooner. But jealousy has always struck me as a vulgarity of the insecure. I did not watch my wife for signs of disloyalty, because I had no appetite for theater and no respect for paranoia. When Michael took to stopping by our house on Sunday evenings with Irish pastries from a bakery Claire liked, I assumed he was leaning into family. When Claire started referencing conversations she had with Michael about the gala donors, I assumed they were working. When she began defending him in meetings with a precision that sounded prepared, I assumed she was being fair. What I did not assume was appetite. Appetite hides best in useful people. The second sign arrived as paper. It usually does. A junior associate in our acquisitions group brought me a draft memorandum on the lakeside property and asked whether I wanted the revised earn-out schedule to include the side understanding. He said this with the mild boredom of someone who thinks everyone above him has already agreed to the questionable thing. I asked him what side understanding he meant. He hesitated, then named a consulting fee arrangement that would divert a percentage of the post-acquisition management contract into an outside advisory entity called Green Harbor Strategies. I had never heard of it. He showed me the draft. The entity had been referenced in 2 internal emails and 1 redlined schedule. Michael had approved all 3. I asked who else knew. The associate said Claire had reviewed the donor conflict language because one of the limited partners intended to make a public gift at the gala after the acquisition closed. Claire, my wife. I stood there with the memorandum in my hand and felt the strange private cooling that comes when suspicion first acquires architecture. I did not accuse anyone. That is important. Men who accuse too soon only teach liars where to repair the seam. That night I opened the study door at home more quietly than usual. Claire was inside, seated at the desk by the window, reading from her phone with a look on her face I had not seen in years. Not softness, anticipation. It passed before she looked up, but not fast enough. "You're early," she said. Not "hello," not "how was your day?" Just a statement of disrupted timing. I asked what she was working on. She smiled and turned the screen face down. "Gala seating problems. Your favorite kind." I remember nodding as if I believed her because by then I had become interested in the quality of her performance. Some betrayals announced themselves with heat. Mine arrived with method. Over the next 8 days, I did what I always do when something threatens the structure holding up my life. I looked for records before I looked for motives. I hired a forensic accountant named Ruth Vass without telling anyone at the office. Ruth had once unwound a procurement fraud for a hotel chain in Baltimore, and afterward described the whole matter as a bad marriage conducted through invoices. I trusted her immediately. She was narrow-faced, exact, and not interested in anyone's pain except where it altered the arithmetic. I gave her access to the Palmer House files, the advisory entity references, and a limited slice of internal communications. I told her I needed discretion. She told me discretion cost extra. I told her to add it to the invoice. While Ruth worked, I watched. Watching is a discipline people romanticize when they do not understand how humiliating it becomes in practice. There is nothing noble about noticing that your wife adjusts her lipstick before leaving for committee calls, or that your cousin has begun using a cologne he once mocked because she once said she liked cedar. There is nothing grand about realizing that 2 people you fed, trusted, excused, and defended have developed a shared language of glances in front of you. It does not make you tragic. It makes you late. On the 10th of March, Ruth came to my office with a thin blue folder. She sat down, placed it on the desk, and said, "You have 3 problems, but they're all sleeping together." It was an unkind phrase. I appreciated it. The outside advisory entity, Green Harbor Strategies, was controlled through layered registration by a Delaware shell that led, finally and without dignity, to Michael. The fee arrangement was designed to siphon post-acquisition income over 18 months in a way that would not trigger immediate review unless the investors performed a very specific reconciliation. Claire had edited language around donor-related disclosures and conflict waivers in 2 drafts, creating enough ambiguity to shield the entity from initial scrutiny. More than that, Ruth had found a series of private dinner reimbursements charged to gala planning that placed Claire and Michael together repeatedly over the prior 4 months, often on evenings when each had said they were elsewhere. I asked whether that proved an affair. Ruth looked at me for a long moment and said, "No, it proves conspiracy. You can decide how much romance you need." I thanked her. She left. I remained in my chair and read through the file twice. Then I stood, closed the office blinds, and read it a third time. Pain, when it is clean, has very little texture. What I felt was not heartbreak in the dramatic sense. It was a hard rearranging of internal weight, a recognition that certain rooms in my life would never again hold the furniture I had placed in them. That evening, Claire and I attended a donor supper at the Ashdown Club. She wore dark green silk and a small gold pin in the shape of a harp. Men, twice as wealthy as I was, stood up when she approached the table. Women who had spent years mastering poise adjusted themselves slightly in her presence. Michael arrived 20 minutes late, easy and apologetic, kissed Claire on the cheek in front of 3 trustees, and put a hand on my shoulder as he sat. "We'll carry this one together," he said. I nearly admired him for saying it while the lie still tasted fresh. I did not confront them. Not yet. Confrontation serves the guilty unless the innocent has already done the accounting. Instead, I began preparing the conditions under which truth would become expensive. That is the part people misunderstand about revenge when they insist on imagining it as rage. Rage is brief, bright, and stupid. What I wanted was not spectacle. I wanted proportion. I wanted the precise cost of their belief that I was too old, too loyal, or too tired to defend the perimeter of my own life. The St. Patrick's Day Gala was 3 nights away. More than 400 guests, press, donors, investors, clergy, 2 aldermen, a state treasurer whose appetite for old whiskey and new influence was equally vulgar. Michael intended to announce the charitable expansion initiative that Claire had helped cultivate. The lakeside acquisition investors would be in attendance, along with the family whose retreat property we were repositioning. Green flowers, polished brass, string quartet in the lower salon, Irish standards after 10, photographers near the staircase, whiskey tasting in the library, and enough well-dressed memory in the room to make scandal feel almost sacramental. Michael loved an audience. Claire did not, but she understood the uses of one. I spent the next 2 days making small administrative choices that looked like fatigue, and were in fact preparation. I reassigned final presentation authority for the charitable initiative from Michael to me on the ground that the investors wanted senior reassurance. I asked our outside counsel, Daniel Ross, to attend the gala earlier than planned, so we could review closing timelines in person with the investors. I invited Ruth as a private guest under the description of an acquisition consultant. I had Luke Hartwell, our Director of Compliance, assemble source materials on the Palmer House transaction and place them in a sealed folio in my office upstairs at the Ashdown. Luke was not family, though he had known us long enough to observe the distinction without reverence. He had worked under me 6 years, and understood both loyalty and paper. When I told him I might need quiet document control during the gala, he asked no questions beyond the operational. I promoted him in my mind that same minute. On the afternoon of March the 17th, the city was noisy with celebration. Green beer for boys, green ties for judges, green lights on stone buildings older than the men currently pretending to own them. At noon, I walked the ballroom alone before staff arrived. White cloths, silver flatware, crystal catching pale daylight, a bandstand at one end under draped velvet, centerpieces of white hydrangea, bells of Ireland, and dark eucalyptus. Everything arranged to suggest continuity, refinement, lineage. This is what wealth does when it wants to look moral. It chooses flowers with good posture. Claire arrived at 5:30. She crossed the ballroom with a clipboard in one hand and her coat unbuttoned, all movement and quiet command. When she kissed my cheek, I smelled the perfume she used in the first years of our marriage, the one she had stopped wearing a decade earlier because she said it belonged to a woman she no longer was. "You look tired," she said. "I am," I told her. That much, at least, was true. Michael came in at 6:10, laughing with one of the trustees, and for a moment the three of us stood beneath the chandeliers like a family in an old painting that had not yet learned what fire was. The early part of the evening went as expected. Cocktails in the library. Donors reminiscing about men whose generosity had mostly consisted of surviving long enough to put their surnames on buildings. Trustees discussing scholarship initiatives with the solemnity of card players naming stakes. Claire moved through the rooms with perfect calibration. Michael performed ease. I watched him from the margins, and thought that charm is only dangerous when it meets someone who is tired of being careful. He caught my eye once across the bar, and lifted his glass as if sharing a private joke. I lifted mine back. It steadied me to know that one of us understood the moment, and the other did not. At 8:15 we moved into the ballroom for dinner. Speeches after the second course. Scholarship pledge announcement after dessert. The charitable initiative and acquisition preview after coffee. I had changed the order at the last minute, citing investor schedules. Michael objected lightly in front of staff, then smiled when I did not invite further discussion. Claire noticed. I saw the small stillness in her shoulders that had always appeared when she sensed a room shifting under her feet. Dinner passed in practiced elegance. I gave the opening remarks. Michael charmed the room during the scholarship toast. Claire spoke briefly about preservation, community, and memory, with exactly the right amount of feeling to flatter the donors without exposing herself to their sentiment. There are women who use beauty as leverage. Claire never needed to. She used control. Watching her from the podium, I understood something I should have understood years earlier. Her greatest gift was not affection, but adaptation. She could become what a room rewarded faster than anyone I had ever known. When coffee was served, I stood again and thanked our guests for their loyalty to the city, the cause, and the institutions that hold history in place when everything else wants to cheapen it. I spoke about stewardship, about inheritance, about the responsibility of names. Then I said that before we announced the next phase of the charitable initiative, there was a matter of governance I needed to resolve because transparency was, after all, the foundation of trust. That word changed the room. Trust, it always does. Donors stopped lifting cups. Michael looked at me with a polite confusion that had not yet located fear. Claire set down her spoon very carefully. I asked Daniel Ross to join me at the front. He did. I asked Luke to bring the folio from my office. He did that too. No one spoke. The band members, waiting near the stage, looked away with the professional tact of men accustomed to private ruin in formal wear. Then I addressed the investors seated near the center tables and said that in reviewing the Palmer House acquisition, we had identified an undisclosed advisory structure tied to internal parties, along with document edits affecting disclosure language. I spoke calmly. Calm is devastating in public, It denies the guilty the refuge of hysteria. Michael stood halfway through my second sentence. "James," he said, with a smile shaped like warning, "this is neither the time nor the place." That line has probably been spoken by every man caught in every century. I looked at him and said, "The time was when you drafted a feed aversion behind my back. The place was anywhere you still assumed I would protect you." Then I asked Daniel to summarize the governance concern for the investors. He did not embellish. Lawyers rarely improve on clean facts. Undisclosed beneficial interest, altered language, potential conflict breach, internal review, suspension of authority pending resolution. Claire did not move for several seconds. Then she stood, composed as ever, and said, "You are making a private misunderstanding sound like fraud." I turned to her and, for the first time that evening, allowed a measure of feeling into my voice. "No," I said. "I am making fraud sound like the private understanding it depended on." A few people lowered their eyes then, not out of shame for me, but from the embarrassment of being present when a marriage stops pretending in public. Michael began talking fast. That was how I knew he was frightened. He used words like provisional, standard practice, misunderstood structure, and bridge compensation. He said the advisory vehicle was temporary. He said Claire's edits were contextual. He said I had been overloaded, and that he had merely tried to protect the timeline. Then, because fear makes fools reach for intimacy, he added, "I've been holding this place together while you grieved things you refused to bury." That line landed harder than the rest because it was not entirely false. Betrayers are at their most offensive when they season theft with insight. I let the silence after that grow long. Then I said, "You have confused my silence for absence." I opened the folio, removed copies of the reimbursement records, the entity filings, and the redlined drafts, and passed them to Daniel, who passed them to the Investors' Council and the principal family representative. The room was no longer a gala. It was a hearing wearing linen. Claire came toward me then, not dramatic, not pleading, just precise. "Don't do this here," she said quietly enough that only the nearest tables could hear. It was the first honest thing she had said to me in weeks. She did not mean do not destroy us. She meant do not destroy us in front of these people. She still believed scale was negotiable. I looked at her and saw not the woman I had married, not even the woman who had betrayed me, but the woman who had made a study of environments and could not bear one she could not master. "You chose here," I told her. "You just chose it in installments." The investors withdrew to the library with Daniel. The family representative went with them. Michael tried to follow and was blocked by one of our senior staff on my instruction. The guests remained frozen in their seats, caught between appetite and decency. Some left. The better ones did it quickly. The worse ones lingered and looked busy with napkins. Claire stood beside the center table with one hand resting lightly on a chair back, her face calm in the way marble is calm. Then she asked the question I had expected all evening. "How much do you know?" I said. "Enough." It might have ended there in a purely professional collapse if Michael had kept what remained of his pride. Instead, he said, loudly enough for half the room, "Tell them the rest, James. Tell them why you needed to do it this way. Tell them because she chose me." A vulgar move. Effective, too. Public rooms still prefer adultery to accounting. You could feel the atmosphere change. Donors who had almost managed the decency of leaving now found their reason to stay. Claire closed her eyes for half a second. That was the only crack I saw in her all night. I did not answer him immediately. I looked at her first, because even then some loyal fragment of me wanted to know whether she would lie one final time. She met my eyes and did not deny it. That was almost merciful. "How long?" I asked. "Since November," she said. Michael laughed once under his breath, as if the truth itself might still flatter him. 5 months. Long enough for habits. Long enough for codes and private jokes and rehearsed injuries. Long enough for them to build an interpretation of me that made betrayal feel like correction. What happened next is the part people later embroidered into something colder and more elegant than it was. They said I had orchestrated a moral execution. They said I had waited for the perfect room. They said I was merciless. That gives me too much credit. The truth is simpler. I had become a man who finally understood that preservation and concealment are not the same thing. For years I had called my restraint wisdom because it kept the structure standing. That night I saw more clearly. Sometimes restraint is just fear with good tailoring. I asked the staff to clear the ballroom and continue coffee service in the side salon for any guests who wished to remain. Within 10 minutes, most had gone. The investors stayed. Daniel stayed. Ruth stayed in the back near the columns, watching as if she had expected no better from any of us. Claire sat at a small table near the stage, upright and pale. Michael paced once, then stopped when he realized movement made him look cornered. The investors terminated the Palmer House structure that evening. Not the acquisition itself, but our lead position in it. They invoked review rights and suspended Michael from all representation pending a formal inquiry. Daniel advised them we would cooperate fully. I said we would. Michael called me insane. He said I was burning millions over vanity. Perhaps. But there are losses that clarify the balance sheet of a life. The acquisition would survive without us. What would not survive, and did not deserve to, was the fiction that I should absorb betrayal because the numbers would look better in the quarter. Claire asked to speak to me privately around 11. We went upstairs to my office above the ballroom, where the window looked out over a street full of green scarves and drunken songs. She removed her gloves one finger at a time and placed them on the desk. "I never meant for it to become what it became," she said. "That is another classic line. Useless, but popular." I asked whether she had loved him. She gave a small, tired smile. "That isn't the right question." "It is for me," I said. She took longer with the answer than with any lie she had told me. "I loved what I didn't have to carry with him," she said at last. "With you, everything had weight." I stood by the window and let that sentence settle where it belonged. "So you chose lightness," I said. "No," she said. "I chose relief." That hurt more because it was truer. I told her I would file for divorce quietly if she cooperated fully with counsel, documented her role accurately, and stayed away from any attempt to rewrite the record socially. She stared at me for a moment and said, "You sound like you're closing a venue." I answered, "I am closing an arrangement." She almost laughed. Instead, she asked whether I had ever loved her more than the business. I could have lied for dignity. I did not. "At first," I said. Then I thought building something durable was how I loved you. Maybe I was wrong. She looked at me with something like pity then, and I understood that pity is sometimes the final insult between two people who once shared a bed. Michael refused privacy. He confronted me in the corridor outside the office while staff carried floral arrangements downstairs and the cleaners waited discreetly at the end of the hall. He called me sanctimonious. He said I had always needed to be the good son, the burdened one, the serious one, as if integrity were a costume I wore to win our dead parents. He said Claire had come to him because I had turned every room in my life into a ledger. "Do you know what it's like," he said, "to stand next to you your whole life and be treated like weather while you got to be the architecture?" It was a sharp line. He had probably been saving it for years. I looked at him and felt, unexpectedly, not rage, but fatigue. The old fatigue. The one from boyhood, from funerals, from unpaid debts, from cleaning up after charming men. "Yes," I said. "I know exactly what it's like to stand next to you and keep the roof from falling." He hit the wall with the side of his fist, not hard enough to damage it, only hard enough to perform injury. Then he said the only thing that almost moved me to cruelty. He said, "You needed me. That's why this hurts." I stepped closer to him, close enough that he had to meet my eyes without the help of posture. "No," I said. "I loved you. That's why this hurts. Need had nothing to do with it." He had no answer to that. Most selfish men do not know what to do with love once it is separated from dependence. It leaves them without leverage. The weeks after St. Patrick's Day were uglier than the night itself. Public collapses end quickly. Administrative ones do not. Lawyers, statements, quiet calls to lenders, controlled disclosures to donors. The charitable initiative survived under revised governance with Claire's name removed and Michael's authority stripped entirely. The Palmer House acquisition passed to another operator. Michael threatened to litigate, then discovered that fraud becomes less romantic when billed monthly by counsel. Claire moved into a furnished apartment on the north side and signed the divorce papers 6 weeks later with almost ceremonial efficiency. There was no screaming, no scene, no final appeal. We divided property like diplomats separating a failed border. The city talked for a month and then, as cities do, found fresher appetites. A councilman's scandal, a chef's overdose, a bishop's retirement. Michael drifted through a series of interim ventures, financed by men who still mistook charm for governance. He called twice in the first year, once drunk and once sober. I did not answer either time. Claire sent one letter, handwritten, 6 pages long, trying with admirable intelligence to explain the interior weather that had made betrayal feel reasonable to her. I read it once and burned it in the sink, not from anger, from refusal. Some explanations are merely elegant attempts to retain influence over the memory of what was done. People assumed I must have felt victorious. They like that story because it restores symmetry. Betray me, and I expose you. Hurt me, and I answer proportionately. But revenge, even the quiet kind, is not symmetry. It is surgery. Necessary sometimes, clarifying sometimes, clean if done well. But no one leaves surgery stronger on the same day. For months afterward, I moved through my office and my apartment, like a man who had correctly amputated something and still reached for it by habit. I would hear a dry remark in a meeting, and think to tell Claire later. I would pass a restaurant Michael liked, and remember him at 19, shivering in my coat outside a train station after I paid to bring him home from some avoidable disaster. Memory is vulgar that way. It keeps the innocent and the guilty in the same drawer. By summer, the business had steadied. Luke became chief operating officer the following January. Ruth stayed on retainer longer than either of us expected, because I discovered that people who respect numbers and contempt have a way of improving one's standards. I sold the old house Claire and I had shared, and bought a narrower place near the river with less history in the walls. On certain nights, when the city was wet and the lights blurred green against the black water, I would pour a small whiskey and stand at the window remembering the gala not as a triumph, but as a border crossing. The man before that night believed loyalty could be preserved through endurance. The man after it understood that some forms of loyalty become self-betrayal if maintained beyond evidence. The next St. Patrick's Day came cold and bright. The Ashdown Club hosted the gala again under cleaner management and stricter controls. I attended, spoke briefly, donated generously, and left before the music turned sentimental. Outside, boys in green jackets were shouting songs they did not understand. A woman with glitter on her cheeks laughed into the shoulder of a man she would probably forget by April. Taxis hissed through slush. Somewhere far off, a church bell marked the hour with more dignity than anyone on the street. I stood there in the cold and realized that the day no longer belonged to the betrayal. It belonged to the decision that followed it. I do not forgive Michael. I do not forgive Claire. That is not bitterness. It is taxonomy. Forgiveness is often advertised as moral superiority, when in truth it is just one possible use of memory. I chose another. I chose accuracy. I chose distance. I chose not to let the people who had mistaken my restraint for weakness continue to use my love as working capital. There are losses that diminish a man. There are others that refine his edges until he can finally see the outline of his own life without interference. St. Patrick's Day taught me nothing about luck, and even less about grace. What it taught me was narrower and more durable. It taught me that betrayal ripens in comfort, that silence can protect the wrong things, and that when the hour comes to defend the architecture of your life, you must do it without noise and without apology. My name is James Bernett. I built my life twice. The first time with loyalty, the second time with judgment. Only one of those structures still stands.